Right now, our next speaker comes to us from Los Angeles. Dr. Dan Siegel is a professor of psychiatry. He's with the UCLA School of Medicine. He's the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. He's also the executive director of the MindSight Institute. It focuses on the development of mindsight and teaches insight, empathy, and integration for individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel is going to be speaking about dissolving borders through empathy. Hello, Dan. Great to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Mary. It's an honor to be here with you, and welcome to everyone. It's really quite exciting to be exploring the roots of empathy by diving deeply into what empathy actually is from a scientific point of view. And we'll be taking a framework of science where we combine all the different disciplines of science, everything from math and physics to sociology and anthropology, and put them together into one framework. And that framework has a name called Interpersonal Neurobiology. And from this framework, when we ask questions like, what is empathy? Or what is the self that is having empathy? We try to take a broad perspective that hopefully will be useful to you in the important work you're doing to try to make a more empathic world. So let's begin with just some simple definitions. The term empathy for some scientists is equated with emotional resonance. And when they take this kind of perspective, what's sometimes said is that there is a downside to empathy, that you can resonate too much with someone's emotions and get burnt out. So a number of articles and even books will say, oh my gosh, empathy is not such a good thing. What's really good is compassion. And I feel that these perspectives are quite limited in the sense that when people hear them, they actually begin to think, oh, empathy is not something we should encourage because someone wrote that there's a downside to it. There's a dark side to it, that it's somehow not good to be empathic. What they're really referring to is a broader question about what is empathy really, and how can we see that it is of benefit to our sense of well-being, internally for our individual lives, relationally for our interpersonal connections, and even for our connections within nature. And we'll be identifying those three facets of our connectedness, if you will, connections inside of our bodies, connections to other human beings, and connections within all of nature as fundamental aspects of empathy. So let's look at what a broader view of empathy is. We can begin with that notion that empathy includes emotional resonance, feeling another person's feelings. That's one of at least 5 aspects of empathy. A second aspect of empathy is to actually have what's called perspective taking. So if I were being empathic with Mary, it would be, I would say, if I was looking through her glasses, as I was looking from her point of view, how would things seem to me? What would her perspective be? So that's perspective taking on top of our first facet of empathy, which is feeling another person's feelings or emotional resonance. A third facet of empathy that's studied is the idea that I can understand Mary's experience. I can think, well, I know this about her background, this about her childhood, this about where she's at now in her life. And given all these things that I understand about Mary's subjective experience, what would my cognitive understanding, a kind of cognitive empathy, be, where I'd logically think through with emotional insight, so it would build on emotional intelligence, how she might be conducting her life and what things might have meaning for her. So I need to use social intelligence as well to understand cognitively what empathically I can understand about Mary's experience. A fourth facet of empathy is that when someone else does well, if Mary succeeds at something and is joyful, I can actually have empathic joy. I can feel excited about her successes. And this is one of the important facets of empathy, that's often missing in our competitive cultures that we live in. Empathic joy, this can be called, or sympathetic joy, is so important because imagine a world where instead of feeling threatened by others' happiness, we actually feel enlivened by it, that we're empowered to then have people do well in the world. And it's possible to develop empathic joy. We just need to actually focus on that in a sometimes highly, comparative world that we live in, especially on social media. A fifth facet that we'll talk about empathy is called empathic concern. And this is basically where we sense someone else is not doing so well. For example, they may be feeling sad or really upset for various reasons, angry, fearful. In some way, they're suffering. They're not feeling in a positive way. And we're concerned about that suffering. And then we want to use that empathic concern, this fifth facet of empathy, to open up a different set of networks in our own brain, if you will, that are the networks of compassion. And compassion, which for about 98% of us requires empathic concern to be a window that opens it up, we then feel the other person's suffering. So that's a form of empathy, to feel another person's feelings. And then we think about what might we do to help reduce that person's suffering? And then we take action to reduce that suffering. So you can see that in terms of one individual inside of their skin encased body, to be empathic with another has at least 5 facets of what that word means. And in Roots of Empathy, I think all 5 are cultivated in a beautiful, beautiful way. And so when I've had the opportunity to go with Mary Gordon to the schools, various schools where Roots of Empathy is taught, I've been very impressed with how, in fact, these 5 facets of empathy are a part of what the kids are learning, whatever their grade is, when they're watching the infant in that program. Now, what I'd like to do is talk to you about what's the connection about developing empathy and developing well-being. And we're going to look at a number of scientific findings. One is just that the relationships we have with our own bodily experience, so an inner relationship, with other people, so connections interpersonally, and then with nature, connections with the living world. Each of these 3 aspects of connection, if you will, can be identified as a kind of spatial way of referring to energy flow. For the inner, it's energy flow happening inside this body I was born into. But what we need to realize is that energy flow is not limited by the skull nor the skin. In fact, it can be shared between one human being and another human being, or like in Roots of Empathy, in a group of human beings. So we can call that the interpersonal, inter meaning between, the personal meaning the within. So interpersonal is how we actually bring our whole bodily self to then share energy, and some of that energy is in a symbolic form called information. So we're sharing energy and information in what is called a relationship. Now, studies show that not only is our relationship with other people so important for our well-being, but our relationship within nature is important. And many children are getting, this nature insufficiency, this inadequate amount of time they're out in the natural world. And yet the studies are very clear that our ability to focus attention, to reduce anxiety, to reduce depression, and to feel a sense of thriving are enhanced by all these relationships, by relationships in nature is what I was thinking about there, but you could apply those same things to our relationships with other people. So what I'd like to do in the last few minutes of our time together today is just ask you to consider that the word that is not being said here is the word self, S-E-L-F. And I want you to consider that in modern culture, we often think of self as something defined by the body. So if you were to say to me, where is the self of Dan? You might point to my body. I might do the same thing. If I said to you, where's your self? You might point to your body. If we said, where's the mind that's creating yourself? Some people might point to their head. Some people might point to their heart. Wherever you would point, it's generally inside the body for modern culture. Some people call it Western culture, but I did that once with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he made sure to say to me, don't call it Western. It's all around the world now. So now I use the word modern culture because it's East and West. So in modern times, we have this individualistic view, is what an anthropologist would call it. The most individualistic place in the world is the United States of America, where this body lives. And sadly, what we can show is that when you view the self as only individual, you get an excessive activation of a certain network in the brain in your head called the default mode network, which, when it's overly differentiated, can give you a feeling of anxiety, depression, disconnection. And in that view of a totally separate self, what I want to have you consider is that it comes from this sequence of categories and concepts, even beneath our awareness, that say that the self is in your body. So you may say, well, Dan, what are you talking about? Of course the self is in my body. But if the self is a center of experience, let's just call it that, then what I would like you to consider is that all of the relationships we just talked about, being tuned in a sense, to your own inner life of your body, would be almost like inner empathy, being tuned in to the sensations, the perspective, and even the agency. So there's an acronym for you, SPA, the sensations or subjectivity, the perspective or point of view, the agency or the actions. This SPA is a helpful acronym for saying, what is the self? Well, sure, you have an inner SPA, right? This inner subjectivity, perspective, and agency. But our relationships with other people are also a self. There's an inner self, sure, inside the body. There's also an inter self. And this relational aspect of self has a sensation to it, a perspective to it, an agency to it that you can feel with these 5 facets of empathy. And then you go, well, wow, so that inter self is both with people, yes, and within nature, yes. So then you take a big step back, and I'll ask you just to do a simple, fun exercise. If you're capable of lifting up your hand and looking at your thumb, take a look at your thumb, right? And focus your eyesight, if you have the capacity to do this, or if you're challenged in vision, just use hearing and try to shift a kind of identity lens. If you have vision, let's do it that way. Look at your thumb, right? You can see your thumb. It's a part of this body you were born into. But now let your eyesight go beyond the thumb to whatever's past it, and look at the specific thing beyond your thumb, and notice how it's no longer a part of your body, but it's a part of the world in which you live. And now, as you're looking past your thumb, let that very focused and, in a sense, narrow lens become wide angled, and still look beyond your thumb and take in the whole panorama of what is in front of you. And notice now, you're taking in the whole picture. This is also the world that has a sensation to it, perspective to it, and you can act on behalf of it, like supporting a reduction in racism and social injustice, like supporting environmental protection. And all these ways of seeing people who may not look like you in terms of our different, quote, race, which is actually a mental construction, can allow us to see we can differentiate people and even species to realize we are all a part of one whole. The way I try to remember this ability to move an identity lens from near to far, to make it wide angle, is to realize we have, yes, a close me, but we also have a relational we. And to integrate those two, what I'll leave you with is that what we can do is have a we, me plus we equals the integrated self, the integrated identity and broader belonging of we, MWE. And that is how we let empathy blossom in our lives together. And together, we can make this a more empathic, a kinder, a more compassionate world for all of us, for human beings and for all of nature. Thank you so much for sharing this journey with me. And now I'll send it back to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was absolutely fascinating. I find it interesting that you are the second person to mention the Dalai Lama today in a talk, because Richard Davidson mentioned him earlier. And I know Mary Gordon, in fact, has met the Dalai Lama at least once or twice. I feel like the odd person out here. I'm just not tight with the Dalai Lama myself.
Well, he is a very fun-loving person, full of joy, and a beautiful book that he wrote with a colleague of mine and Desmond Tutu is called The Book of Joy. And if you haven't read that, it's by Doug Abrams and Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. It's a beautiful and fun romp through the importance of compassion and joy in our lives.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Jen. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, Mary. A pleasure. Thanks to all of you.